bit, I'd now like to introduce Mr. Steve Davies. Steve is a former public servant of more than 30 years, working in various roles. He's also the founder of Ausloop. Now, Steve's mission is to engage Australian public servants and community colleagues to network and improve the present and help shape the future. I'm sure Steve has a lot of interesting things to talk about. Please welcome Steve.
Okay, I'll just use this to move the slides, don't I? Okay, okay. And Kate's example was wonderful. Best one I've seen. Okay. For some of us, I was reflecting on what I was going to say here, for some of us involved in the social media space, and indeed some of this goes back to the activities around Gov 2.0, I think there was a strong sentiment that this was going to open up some sort of communications utopia. Now, I'm not saying everyone thought that, but, you know, some of us do passionately. That's probably one of the areas that, well, the public service or public service agencies, you know, that we do sort of live in a bureaucracy. I think they find that difficult because if you say you've got a communications utopia, what would that be for, well, certainly most of the people I've spoken to? Authentic, open and fearless communication. So the fact that you get a hostile tweet or a bit of criticism online to your agency, well, you know, it doesn't mean you actually don't do it, and that's why I particularly mentioned Kate's stuff. Now, what I see through my work is that in the public service there's a strong element of dystopia, and that really comes from the Australian Public Service Commission. And in particular, I'm referring to the provisions that say, you know, if you are so harsh in your criticism that it might bring your agency into disrepute or bring the APS into disrepute. Now, it doesn't actually say what sort of criticism, so that's one moot point. But the other is, I mean, in my lighter moments, I often think it's somewhat of a joke. I mean, are they really saying that our institutions, long-lived institutions that are robust, are going to come crashing down? So it raises some important questions. I think it's unhealthy, but I think what that mindset, which is what it's a reflection of, does, is it robs us of a capability. And I'll refer back to one of Mia's points that, you know, social media is not new, the technology is not new, it's been with us a long time. We have had years and years to build a widespread and deep capability amongst our or against people in APS agencies, not just comms practitioners. So, in part, that's where I'm coming from. What I want to do in this is take a broad sort of sweep through stuff. Open data we tend to feel quite comfortable about. Charts, numbers and so on, as long as it's not, you know, classified, etc., etc. So the number of data sets online are increasing, as are the number of FOI requests. So we tend to feel comfortable with that. What we're seeing, though, in relation to open data is that community expectations are increasing. They don't want a crude spreadsheet anymore. They want something they can play with. And certainly overseas, and I can see it emerging here, is that, you know, there are citizens out there active online, so you're facing this prospect of everyone sort of becoming a researcher, looking at your data, and especially if they're journalists, etc., etc. My sort of favourite topic. Another element in this, of course, is the WikiLeaks phenomenon, and if you look at the number of, well, quite a few other entities are emerging and we're sort of trying to break in on that business, as it were. Certainly, mainstream media makes use of the sort of information that comes out of WikiLeaks. Now, I think if we desensationalise that aspect of information and disclosures being made, what we've got, although some of them obviously are controversial, but what we're facing is an environment where providing feedback and disclosing information is actually becoming the norm. Certainly some of that information governments don't like having disclosed, but such is the nature of the beast. I think we have to recognise within that this part of the social media environment, if you like, actually contributes to transparency and accountability. And I don't see them going away. So we end up, from people I've been talking with, this notion of citizens grabbing stuff and seeing stuff and then commenting upon it. So essentially they become investigators. So you've got that sort of mix there. How I see social media is it really is the engine room that's driving those two phenomena forward, so that people can now, both those data and the exposure of stories are rich sources of content for people to comment on social media. And so when they relate to government and public service, I think it's fair to say that they're very, very powerful, which is probably why essentially public servants are being told to shut up online. Yeah, the 99% movement, or Occupy. Bit of a failed movement really in my book, but the slide illustrates the point. When we're in an environment where any citizen, any group of citizens, employees can criticise online, can comment on richer sources of information online, can comment on disclosures, etc., etc. That's a very potent mix. I think the difference is that people who are active in that way are self-authoring, so they're not going to be scripted, as it were, by corporate speak. So it's a very wild and free environment. Looking at that, and certainly from people I've spoken to and the work that we've been doing, is that in essence, courtesy of social media and courtesy of that broad social and technical sweep, we are facing, the public service is facing an age of radical transparency and accountability. And again, I think that explains the defensive routines that are emanating from the bureaucracy. About a third of my background is in HR, and the dream used to be that HR would usher in this sort of golden age of learning organisations and so on. And essentially that function has now become the policeman, the policing function within an agency. So again, they're part of this. It's extending into agencies, saying be careful what you say online, or better still, don't say anything at all. Where I see the implications for how we communicate and who we communicate with in all of that is communications practitioners becoming facilitators of open dialogue in conversations. You're not going to get that from HR anymore. They're too busy shutting it down. So I think that is the major implication of where social media is going, is not only how we communicate, etc., but we need to be more open about it, build a solid capability, and it's communications practitioners that essentially offer the platform to empower, equip and enable all employees to communicate online. And the reason I'm pushing that issue a bit is that with the volume of information out there, once you enter an environment where you do start to open up, you actually do need a big pool of people who know how to engage in an authentic manner online. There's a bigger issue behind this, I think, and now I can put my glasses down, I didn't need them, is that one of the issues is when you go government, community, public service, and you look at the utterances that come out, we tend to conflate. You can see it in the report in the Canberra Times today. We tend to, what we tend to do, and government obviously plays a part, is to go, this person was sacked, say, from the public service, and then you go, oh, because they were talking about government, right? So we conflate the two issues. As I've read some of those tweets, and they're not criticisms of government policy per se. What they are accounts of events, right? Stuff that actually happens, and it's the public service that makes stuff happen. So I want you to imagine this, and this hooks into the presentation. You've got a sort of a scale, government, the community. So that's a sort of elastic scale, and it's shrinking. And the reason it's shrinking, the gap between government and the big wide world out there, is because of the pressure that's being exerted by social media. So in that sense, yeah, people are coming to get you, right? So the question becomes, the big challenge, I think, in terms of the public service and where it positions itself, how it communicates, etc., is that, is the public service so close to government at the expense of its proximity to the community? And if that's where you want to be, that's all well and good. But if you've got the steamroller of social media and etc. barrelling towards you, then you better go and meet it. So that's my take on all of this. Questions?
Any questions in the audience?
No questions? No.
We've got a question up here.
Oh, hi. I'm Michaela Benerji, who's the subject of the ongoing case.
Mm-hmm.
There's just something that I was very interested to hear you talk about, the conflation of issues. I think that that's a very, very important thing. People are asking me, well, why are you dissing your employer? And I need to remind people who ask me that question that this is not about dissing the employer. This is about having a responsibility to the public as a public servant, because public servants' loyalties go both ways, in my view. I think it's a failure on the part of public servants if they don't at least acknowledge that public servants are have different responsibilities from people who work in other organisations for profit in private companies. The other thing that is really important to realise and understand is that what we're talking about here is an implied freedom from the Constitution for every person to be able to personally, at all times, engage in political communication. That is at the heart of what is going on here. So the question for us and for all public servants, what's happening here is relevant to every one of you who are here. It's relevant for other agencies as well. The APSC guidelines are ambiguous and they are contradictory and they conflate matters. And in the end, what happens is that they distill to the one single prohibition. You are a public servant and you must not criticise government at all times. That is the problem.
Is that the problem or the rule? I guess, Steve, it comes back to your analogy of being elastic, whether the government moves to the people or the people move to the government in terms of social media.
Yeah. I mean, I actually agree with Michaela 100%. Years ago, going back to the mid-90s, we were reforming management in the Northern Territory public sector. I used to work for the Office of the Commissioner of Public Employment up there, and one of the things that we know, well, one of the things that we actually did, we discovered that we had to address middle and senior managers redefining problems, or even better, for some of them, I guess, shooting the messenger. Now, we hooked into Professor Dick McCann and Cole, and had some of this goes back to the work of Chris Argyris, where there are layers of conversation, and this is how. I'll be brave here. This is what the APSC should have done years ago. There's some stuff that we know should not be discussed openly, either because someone's going to die or because it's, it's national security. Fair enough. Between that, there are whole layers of conversation where, if you say to people, do you feel comfortable talking about that? No. But let's find out the rules behind it, right? And it's those unwritten rules, once you tease them out, that you can actually make objective decisions and find a point of comfort or a band of comfort that says to people with confidence, yeah, it's okay to talk about this stuff. What we've got in the Public Service Act, even in the amendments at the moment, is basically an ambiguous tripwire. So someone can have put a quite innocuous tweet up, but if somebody else doesn't like it, someone in a position of power above them doesn't like it, it can become, right, you've breached the APS Code of Conduct. Okay? So until that fundamental conversation about what can be discussed online, not the specifics of it, because, quite frankly, I can't see why, if something happens to be a bit embarrassing for someone in a department, quite frankly, so what? So what at the end of the day? So it's that methodology, and I think maybe some comms people should go and have a play with it, or if they want to contact me, I'm happy to provide some information. Any more questions? Yeah.
We have to, well.
I'm just wondering about following on. Thank you. Following on from your statement that you made, I just wondered, I understand what you were saying about social media is not new. It is still often referred to as innovative and new in many government departments.
Yeah.
And the risk-averse nature of how people approach things. If someone says something so-called inappropriate in the office space, or perhaps puts up a mocking cartoon of their minister in the office space, that is taken on board as being normal office practice. If that was said online, anonymously, therefore that would come on, it has a higher profile because of social media. That's my observation. I was just very interested to hear what anyone in the panel thought about that. Is it the channel of communication which is causing the fear, if you like?
Yeah, they're afraid of the amplification.
Why is that?
Because more people might hear it and give it perceived legitimacy. I mean, that's the favourite mantra that comes out of corporate comms area, that they won't acknowledge something because it might give someone perceived legitimacy. I mean, quite frankly, with stuff, cartoons and this, that, and the other. Well, if they're not defamatory, well, a bit of stupidity you'd tend to ignore, or go and have a quiet chat with someone if you know who they are, and say, "Don't bloody do it again." Some of these things do not require the heavy hand of corporate bureaucrats. What they do require is common sense and the ability to talk to people, and indeed the ability to actually figure these things out so that we can have an authentically engaged public service. The ideal would be everyone, because of that steamroll that I'm sort of talking about. But we're not doing that. Instead, we're instilling fear, and with that, for all the talk about let's build the capability of the APS, that key capability that's with us now, it's not going to get any better, is being ignored, and in fact, I'd argue, being crushed, and that's unacceptable.
It would be hard to define my disagreement with so much of that conversation without taking up the rest of our time this morning. I think I'd refer you to a couple of facts that you might be interested in. Look at Circular 1 of 2012 from the Public Service and determine that, in fact, it says that there's no difference between commenting online and offline. The same rules apply. And if you put up, and it could be determined that you'd put up something that was defamatory to the department inside your department on a notice board, I'd suggest that you would be treated in a very similar fashion to if you had done that online. And I think that's the reality of the situation. Now, it might be that anonymous posting on a notice board is more anonymous than posting on the internet. That's probably true. But the bottom line is that behaviour is treated the same. There's clearly a gradation of the way that people do things and how they're corrected over time, because not everybody is the subject to the same level of action. People do say to people, you know, perhaps you should reconsider posting things like that. Perhaps you should have thought of that. Maybe if you did that the next time. I've done that inside my organisation. I'm sure a whole bunch of other public servants have done that as well. And if I might finish on a somewhat lighter note, I don't think bureaucrat is a pejorative term at all. We need bureaucracy to keep democracy functioning.
I agree with the latter statement, John. I think, but the problem is with a lot of this stuff, where they say harsh criticism, they're leaving out one important element, the truth.
If you look at the guidance, you can read out that it talks about unreasonable criticism of an agency's clients and stakeholders, so harsh or extreme that about the government not having faith in you. It talks about things that can't be justified. All of those things are included in the general principles of the Circular 1 of 2012. It doesn't allow the freedom, I think, Steve, that you've suggested.
They're still very ambiguous.